terminate your co-founder with a single, unblinking stare. 40 years of corporate equity evaporated in a $15 million liquidation. However, this immediate lump, the CEO leveraged strategic silence to trap his victim into trading, appreciating assets. This calculated asymmetric exploitation illustrates why the elite treats savings as a failure and asset control as the only law. Most Americans look at $1 million bank balance and see a safety net. The masters of the organizational hierarchy look at that same balance and see a strategic failure. In high-stakes power plays, cash is the consolation prize handed to those being pushed out of the inner circle to keep them docile, while the elite retain ownership of the future. While the middle class is conditioned to hoard stagnant currency, which is slowly eroded by the invisible tax of inflation, the masters of the corporate machine treat capital as a tool of leverage. They recognize the brutal reality that as of late, household net worth reached a record $168.8 trillion, but that growth wasn't found in savings accounts. It was driven by a $3.8 trillion gain in corporate equities, while cash-heavy real estate holdings actually declined. Holding money in a traditional account is essentially volunteering to when the consumer price index climbs by 2.9%, as it did in August 2025, while your interest rate remains anchored near zero, your savings are actually a mounting debt to the economy. This is the liquidation trap. The wealthy don't want earned income that is taxed at a crushing 37%. They want the 20% tax efficiency of capital gains and the 0% tax on debt. They understand the dark business psychology of the stagnant dollar. Cash is a melting ice cube, and if you aren't moving it with velocity, you're the one getting frozen out of the board dynamics. But there was one predatory detail in the secret debt agreements of the ultra-wealthy that didn't make. The architecture of the elite financial machine rests on a three-word mantra coined by Professor Edward McCaffrey: buy, borrow, die. While the average professional spends their career chasing a higher salary only to watch 37% of it vanish into the federal treasury before it even hits their bank account, the strategist operates in the shadows of the tax code. They understand that under IRS Section 1001, the simple appreciation of an asset is not a taxable event. If you own $100 million in tech equities and those shares double in value, you haven't technically earned a dime in the eyes of the IRS. You have gained power, but you have no income. This is where the tactical deployment of leverage becomes a weapon. Instead of selling those shares to fund a lifestyle or a new venture, a move that would trigger a massive capital gains tax and strip them of their compounding interest, the ultra-wealthy utilize what is known as a securities-backed line of credit, or an SBLOC. But there was one catastrophic trigger in these loan documents that could erase a billion-dollar fortune in minutes, and the elite were keeping it quiet. To the uninformed, paying interest to spend your own money sounds like a failure. But to the Machiavellian strategist, it is a masterstroke of tax arbitrage. As of January 2025, SBLOC interest rates hover around 7.375%, typically based on the WSJ prime rate minus a small margin. If your portfolio is generating a 10% annual return and you borrow against it at 7%, you are effectively being paid a 3% spread to live tax-free. Because loan proceeds are legally classified as debt, not income, they are invisible to the taxman. You are extracting liquid capital from a stagnant asset without surrendering ownership or triggering a tax event. This is the ultimate form of asymmetric information exploitation, using the bank's own balance sheet to shield your wealth from state-sponsored erosion. The billionaire doesn't need a salary. They need a line of credit. They treat their portfolio as a private bank, one that never asks for a repayment as long as this is not saving in the traditional pedestrian sense. It is the high-velocity recycling of capital, ensuring that every dollar remains deployed, growing, and entirely out of reach for those who enforce the rules of the middle class. While you are taught to fear debt, the corporate elite use it as a golden parachute, a way to maintain liquidity while their net worth continues to climb toward the record $168.8 trillion mark recently reported in the Federal Reserve's Z.1 report. This is the first half of the blueprint. Never let the money stop moving, and never, under any circumstances, allow it to be classified as income. By refusing to sell, they maintain their seat at the table of corporate boardrooms and organizational hierarchies, wielding their voting shares while spending the bank's money. It is a psychological trap for the masses. While the public is distracted by the top marginal income tax rate potentially rising to 39.6%, the strategist is busy ensuring they have no income to tax in the first place. In the cold, calculating world of legacy preservation, death is not a tragedy. It is. While the middle class spends decades worrying about the death tax, the ultra-wealthy are focused on a far more potent mechanism known as IRS. This is the step-up in basis loophole, and it is the closest thing to a financial delete button that exists in the modern world. To understand the power here, you have to look at the anchoring bias. This is a psychological principle where the first piece of information offered, the anchor, sets the mental boundary for all future negotiations. In the world of taxation, the cost basis is that anchor. If you bought an apartment building in 1970 for $50,000 and it is now worth $5 million, the IRS anchors your profit to that original $50,000. If you sell while you are alive, they take their cut of the nearly $5 million gain. It is a massive loss of leverage that would strip your estate of its most powerful ammunition. But everything the average investor believes about paying your fair share is about to be turned upside down by a single line in the tax code. When an asset holder passes away, Section 1014 allows the heirs to step up that anchor to the current market value. The original $50,000 price tag simply vanishes from the record. For the purpose of the IRS, the heirs effectively bought the building for $5 million the moment the previous owner's heart stopped. They can liquidate the entire portfolio the next morning and pay zero, absolutely zero, capital. This is a masterclass in exploiting asymmetric information within the organizational hierarchy of the state. By utilizing this strategic reset, the elite ensure that the velocity of their wealth is never slowed by the friction of the 20% capital gains rate that would cripple anyone else. This is the final movement in the buy, borrow, die framework. It is why the elite view their estates not as a pile of cash to be inherited, but as a series of perpetually appreciating assets waiting to be cleansed of all tax liability. This maneuver creates a psychological commitment trap for the next generation. Because the heirs receive the assets at a clean basis, they are incentivized to maintain the same leveraged lifestyle their parents pioneered. This isn't just about saving money, it is about stakeholder manipulation on a multi-generational scale. The elite are teaching their descendants that selling is a sign of weakness, a failure of leverage. The actionable takeaway for you is to recognize the anchoring bias in your own financial life. Most people are anchored to what they paid for an asset, which causes them to hold losers too long or sell winners too early out of tax fear. The 1% does not care what they paid. They only care about what the anchor will be when the title transfers. They are not playing the game of saving. They are playing the game of basis management, where the only rule is to never let the government see a realized gain. In the ivory towers of Manhattan and the glass boardrooms of Silicon Valley, wealth is not viewed as a pile of gold sitting in a vault. It is viewed as a river. We call this the velocity of money. While the average American is taught to be a saver, clutching their dollars in a basic bank account like a nervous passenger gripping a handrail. The elite view that behavior as a total strategic surrender. When you save, you are essentially providing the bank with cheap raw materials. They take your stagnant cash and lend it out to the people who actually know how to use power, the masters of leverage. This is where the psychological tactic of loss aversion framing comes into play. The financial industry has spent decades conditioning you to fear the risk of the markets. They want you to feel a deep physical sting at the thought of losing a single dollar in a market dip, while you completely ignore the fact that your savings account is a slow-motion car crash. As of August 2025, with prices rising at nearly 3% per year, your safe money is actually losing its punch. The rich, however, treat their capital like a high-speed engine. They don't want their money sitting in a vault. They want it moving between assets. Look at the hard numbers from the end of 2024. Total household wealth hit a staggering $168.8 trillion, but nearly $4 trillion of that growth came from owning pieces of companies known as equities. Meanwhile, holdings that were heavy in cash actually shrank by hundreds of billions. The elite are fleeing the dollar and sprinting toward ownership because they understand a fundamental truth of the organizational hierarchy. In a world where the government can print more money, the only things that truly matter are the things they cannot print, like land and successful businesses. They use debt, other people's money, to snap up these assets. They know that as money loses its value, it also makes the debt they owe easier to pay back with those weaker dollars. It is a cold, mathematical dominance that turns the borrower into the master and the saver into the servant. But the transition from being a piece on the board to becoming the player begins with a cold, analytical realization. The banking system was never designed to protect your wealth, but to institutionalize your stagnation. You have been socialized to view a savings account as a fortress, when in reality, it is a holding cell where your purchasing power is slowly executed by the silent blade of inflation. To reclaim power, you must adopt the mindset of a corporate raider. This requires a fundamental shift from defending your capital to weaponizing it. The elite understand that the most dangerous position in any organizational hierarchy is the static one. In a world of fiat currency remaining still, you must start viewing your net worth not as a pile of cash, but as a diverse portfolio of collateral that can be leveraged for strategic expansion. But the most devastating revelation was still to come regarding the true identity of those who actually pay for your financial security. While you are institutional stakeholders are using your stagnant deposits to fund the very leverage that the top 1% uses to outpace you. This brings us to a critical tool in the strategist's arsenal. This is called loss aversion framing. And here is how it works in a boardroom or a bank office. In high-stakes power plays, your opponents will frame every move in terms of what you stand to lose rather than what you could capture. They want you focused on the perceived risk of debt, so you overlook the mathematical certainty of cash devaluation. By reframing your financial strategy to focus on the inevitable loss of purchasing power over the manageable risk of strategic leverage, you change the internal board dynamics of your life. The actionable takeaway for your own career and wealth is this: establish your own best alternative to a negotiated agreement, or stop being a retail depositor and start acting like a private equity manager of your own estate. This means shifting your mindset toward acquiring assets that the bank values more than the cash you are currently giving them for free. When you hold the assets, you hold the leverage. You must learn to treat debt as a precision instrument rather than a burden. In the cold psychology of professional dominance, the borrower who uses debt to acquire growth is the master, while the saver who fears the bank is the servant subsidizing that growth. If you continue to follow the rules designed for the middle class, you will continue to get middle-class results, gradual erosion, and a life of strategic ambiguity. The boardroom is a battlefield. If you don't know the rules, you're already losing. Subscribe for more breakdowns of corporate power psychology. Tell us in the comments, what's the most